in Europe and impacting us as NATO members in particular. So, Michael, if you could jump in here. And I just wanted to, you're talking, Professor, about how, the genocide and how many people were killed. You've got to remember, Stalin actually said the death of one person is a tragedy. But the death of a million is a statistic. And so we got to remember each and every one, as you said, these were individuals with stories as we're witnessing today in Ukraine, those that are dying, they come from families, they have their own story, and we need to remember them. That's why we say,
thank you very much, and great presentation. I heard that too. And excuse my raspy voice, I've been talking too much the past few days. But yes, I did bring sunflower oil from Ukraine. All of you know Ukraine is a major exporter of sunflower oil to the world, and there are major shortages of it now because of Russia's blockade. Thank you, excuse me. Thank you to the organizers for having us here today. It's nice to be back in Manitoba, where Canada's heart beats. And also, as you pointed out, I used to work here for the Winnipeg Free Press. And also I studied in grade 10 at St. Lawrence College in Roblin, Manitoba. It's pretty far north already. That's my factor. Right. And but going on to the topic at hand, it's very, very difficult to believe that here we are in 2022 on European soil, and we're seeing forced deportations of families, of adults, of children. We're seeing the weaponization of migration of energy and food. Today is the 246th day of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but I also have to remind everyone, not necessarily you, but perhaps those who are watching online, is that the start of Ukraine's hunger problems go back to 2014 as well in this current war. In 2014, CNN reported that Ukraine was the only country in Europe dependent on handouts from the World Food Program. For most of the time since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I've been in Ukraine, documenting, speaking to a global audience, and also documenting as well about the stealing of food, the deliberate destruction of by Russia of food storage facilities and ports, to the forced deportation of men, women, and thousands of unaccompanied children to Russia. Only a few weeks back on CNN Opinion, this is how we describe the scale of the damage to our global audiences. Decades after the end of Soviet state policy to eradicate Ukrainian nationalism and language, history seems to be repeating itself as the Russian armed forces and their proxies occupy more land. The playbook includes restrictions on the Ukrainian language or access to Ukrainian media and online sites through such tactics as changing school curriculums to align with pro-Russian narratives, switching street signs to Russian, blockading sites like Google, substituting Ukrainian media with their own state-controlled channels, replacing Ukrainian mobile operators with Russian ones, and moving residents who have become trapped in occupied areas onto Russian internet services, where of course you don't have access to the main platforms. The Kremlin has, depending on which numbers you look at, has deported in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 million Ukrainians to Russia. And as you said, many of them through these so-called filtration camps, triggering memories, of course, of Soviet times of Ukrainian dissidents sent to labor camps in the Gulag. We also said on CNN at the time, even Putin's efforts to weaponize food, stealing Ukrainian grain, deliberately shelling farmland, and blockading agricultural products from leaving Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea is reminiscent of what Stalin did in 1932-33. That's when he tried to break the will of the Ukrainian people by triggering a great famine known as the Holodomor, during which millions of Ukrainians died of starvation in the very land that was so fertile that it was called the breadbasket of Europe. Now, Russia's carnage certainly is not limited to food storage facilities and ports, hospitals, and churches. Among the looted cultural and religious items worth hundreds of millions of euros is ancient religious icons, a unique handwritten Torah scroll, and a 200-year-old Bible. You know, it's hard for me to talk about, but during a visit to Chernihiv in late spring, we went on a tour pretty much hosted by Ukazalesnitsa. And one of the first sites we saw after getting off the train was a children's library next to that stadium that was also destroyed. You know, you question yourself, like, why would anyone even do this? But then I talked about this on air, and it was very difficult to not bring tears to your eyes, not have tears to your eyes. But there was also a crater left by what we estimated was a 500-pound bomb dropped by Russia in a populated community outside of Chernihiv. And you look inside, and what we saw were shredded teddy bears. You know, and that told us, of course, that this was a community where there were a lot of children. And it was very, very difficult to come upon that. One of the most jarring images that I saw since the time I've been in Ukraine was in Lviv, when they were getting ready for possible missiles from Russia. And there's this image, some of you might have seen it, I posted it, of a crucifix being taken from a church and put into a pitfall, into a bomb shelter. A hard image to forget. And during a recent visit to Kiev, I also documented how the authorities had gone about to shroud key Ukrainian monuments. And fortunately, they shrouded in protective scaffolding the monument of Taras Shevchenko in Taras Shevchenko Park. And that was exactly the park that was bombed about 3 weeks ago at the height of the commuter hour in Kiev. As far as I know, it survived, but what didn't survive was a playground, a children's playground that was struck by the Russians. It all amounts to the destruction of Ukrainian culture on an industrial scale. And then, of course, in recent days, going more to the present, the Kremlin has been using nuclear terrorism as a weapon, threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons. And speaking, you know, of history repeating itself, it's difficult to fathom that in this war, the Russians actually came back to the site of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster north of Kiev. And it wasn't just sitting there and doing nothing. The soldiers actually dug up contaminated soil and spread it. They looted the offices and the residences of people who operate that plant. And they also harassed staff working there. And as we speak, at Europe's biggest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia, they've also parked their fighting machines there, ammunition. They've also harassed and intimidated staff there. They've kidnapped some of them, and we have become very, very, very close to an accident or an intended accident on a huge scale. And this is something we see almost on a daily basis as the mains power is cut to the plant, and the plant has to rely on generators. And sometimes there's a fear that the fuel will run out there. And then, of course, further south, it's believed that the Russian armed forces are preparing to blow up the hydroelectric dam. The Institute for the Study of War has suggested Russia is, quote, likely continuing to prepare for a false flag attack on the Kakhovka hydroelectric plant by creating information conditions for Russian forces to blow up the dam after they pull out of Western Kherson, and then accuse, of course, the Ukrainians of flooding the river and surrounding settlements. You can imagine how horrible this could be as winter comes, and if that, and I've been at that dam, it's huge. And if all of that water comes down in the middle of winter and freezes, the massive destruction that we're looking at. By the way, this is also a war which I've called the first war that's been played out pretty much over social media in real time. And that's why I think, as you pointed out as well, this is very different than 32, 33, because if you go to TikTok or Twitter or whatever, there's a lot of real-time information about what Ukrainians have been seeing and feeling. And of course, the war happens at a time when the world has never been so interconnected. So nowadays, when you have a flare-up or a conflict anywhere in the world, no matter how small, reverberations tend to go quite around the globe quickly. The war also couldn't have come at a worse time for the world community. 345 million people are facing acute food insecurity in 82 countries. The world now faces a global hunger crisis of unprecedented proportions. And in just 2 years, the number of people facing or at risk of acute food insecurity increased from 135 million in 53 countries pre-pandemic to 345 million in 82 countries today. So fueled by conflict, climate shocks, and COVID-19, the crisis, of course, escalates as the war in Ukraine drives up the cost of food, fuel, and fertilizers. Millions of people around the world are struggling to put food on the table and are being driven closer to starvation in this war of staggering proportions. And it's exacerbated the food crisis in places like Lebanon, where there's a shortage of a lot of things, not only food, but also fuel, to Peru, where all of a sudden people are having to go to food banks to get food to eat. And of course, if there's one thing that this war has reminded people, it is that Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. Many African countries, for example, have a huge dependence on Ukrainian wheat, fertilizers, and other grains. And when Russia blockaded the Black Sea ports after its full-scale invasion in February, low-income countries in Africa and beyond were slammed with an unprecedented wave of food inflation, hunger, and potentially starvation, threatening the stability of their governments as well. Going on quickly to the grain deal. So a lot of people have asked me, why do you think Russia signed this deal? Well, the reason I think is, aside from a lot of pressure from people like President Erdogan of Turkey, but also the UN Secretary General has a lot of skin in the game, is that I think a lot of Russian allies, the Egypts of the world, for instance, were being pushed into unprecedented conditions. Hence, I think they were putting pressure on the Kremlin to get the flow, 20 million tons of backlog grain going through the Black Sea. And the grain deal couldn't have come at a better time also for Ukraine, because agriculture employs 14% of the population and provides 27.8 billion in export revenue in 2021. In August, the US State Department calculated that Russia's military has damaged, destroyed, or taken control of nearly 16% of Ukraine's storage facilities since the latest invasion began in February. So where are we now with the grain deal? Well, it's due for renewal later on in November, but since August 1st, the deal struck in Istanbul resulted in 380 vessels carrying 8.5 million tons of foodstuffs from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. And there are basically 3 ports on the Black Sea near Odessa. I'm now based in Odessa, and I have observed in the past while that the flow of ships has actually been reduced to a trickle. The port has become very quiet. And of course, there's a blame game going on. The Russians are accusing the Ukrainians of delays, but it seems that Russian inspections, the inspections of ships that happens in Istanbul, is slowing the progress here. And again, history repeating itself. I remember in 2014, 2015, when I was part of the OSCE, that the Russians, whenever they had a deal which wasn't tilted in their favor, wasn't going their way, they would back away from it or violate it. So we will see what happens in November, but now there's talk of Mr. Putin, if he goes to the G20 summit in Bali, to use that as leverage to gain something from the West, possibly relief or sanctions. It's actually difficult to fathom that he will actually go to the G20 summit, but now it's being reported that that's kind of going to be the new Kremlin tactic. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. As someone who's been called upon often by news outlets around the world, including CNN, CTV, CBC. You do have that front seat right now to the conflict. Everything that we've heard and seen about the port itself in Odessa is that it was severely damaged. Were they able, I know that I'm hearing that a lot of the ships are starting to blow with the Black Sea because of the contract may not get renewed. They don't want to be sitting around not carrying any cargo. What do you think is Putin's next step in if they don't renew the deal? Has it been taking these Iranian-made drones flown by IRGC terrorists, as I call them, hitting more infrastructure as well as civilian targets in places like Odessa?
Well, I always like to link my presentation on positive notes, but it's very difficult to be positive at the moment. I think what's going to happen is not good at all. And by the way, I should have added that I think we're in the mess that we are right now as well, is because the West failed to delineate where its red lines are. I mean, my goodness, you would have thought that the bombing of that theater in Mariupol, where 600 people died, would have been a red line. You would have thought the bombing of that maternity hospital in Mariupol would have been a red line, where I think 3 people died, including pregnant mother and her unborn child. So Mr. Putin is the type of person where he probes and he probes and he probes for soft tissue, and he only stops until he reaches resistance. Having said that, I think we're looking at a scenario right now where he's not going to gain much on the battlefield, including with the mobilization of 300 men ranging from homeless people to inmates released to who knows who else. I think he's going to resort to the worst type of tactics we know him to use, and that would include not only the missiles, the drones, but I think that in a continued effort to destroy Ukraine, to bring it to its knees, that he will use something like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with something that is put forward as an accident, but it's a deliberate explosion, something like that. I also talked about the dam and what could happen there. And also, don't forget, they also have a good stock of biological and chemical weapons. And they also have what's called hypersonic missiles too. These are expensive. They fly very, very fast. And in fact, we had one of those missiles come to Odessa, and they fly so quickly that they evade all detection. They don't trigger the air raid sirens like the slower missiles do. So those are very, very scary. And they're also, I think they're called trombonic missiles as well, which were used, I believe, in Syria to great effect. And these are nasty, nasty pieces of warfare. They basically destroy internal organs and things like that. So yeah, that's probably where we're headed. I can't see them, again, getting too much success on the battlefield. As for the Ukrainians, just to wrap this up, talking to a lot of people in Ukraine, the feeling, especially after the attack on Kyiv 3 weeks ago, is that we're no longer fearful of the Russians, of the missiles, of the drones. We are angry, and we want to fight to the end, even if we have to do it ourselves. We also have to go to pre-2014 lines, meaning Crimea and the occupied Donetsk and Luhansk. And then finally, it has to be said that the Ukrainians are also hoping that more technology will come from the West in terms of either shooting down those drones and missiles, or as the Russians used to on our OSC, unarmed drones in 2014, there's GPS technology out there that can confuse them very easily without firing one bullet or one missile. But there really is a feeling right now in Ukraine that the West has to put more muscle in the game, more skin in the game, to provide Ukraine with everything it needs. Because, as I always like to say, better we deal with Mr. Putin now on our own terms, rather than later on his terms.
And before I open up for questions on the floor, Christina, you're talking about, how the Soviets carried out Holodomor and committed the genocide and got control, under the whole auspices and false narrative of collectivization. Fast forward to today, and this war is costing Putin, a lot of money. His war machine is still getting funded because of food inflation, because of the insecurity that's been created. Russia is also a major exporter of agricultural products. Even though the West has sanctioned Soviet or Russian oil, I should say, still want to go back to those old terms. He's still able to sell it, thanks to China and other nations that want to turn a blind eye. And carry out false flag operations, sham referendums. Where do you think his next step will be when it comes to feeding that false narrative? Not just the false flag operations, but on the whole aspect of the narrative that he's feeding to his own, Russians in state-controlled media, but also to the world.
Yeah, great question. So when I'm, training now my own PhD students, and I say, you're approaching a conflict, what do you look at? So look at time and space. So Michael and I were reminiscing before the event began about martial law several years ago, right? So this is an escalation of an 8-year conflict. We had martial law, what was it, 2018? So, for people not in this room, right? So for people, not in this room, but others who are reminding them this is an 8-year conflict, that things that would have worked in year 2, the conflict will not work in year 8. And then also this question about space. So what does Putin want? I haven't seen any backing down of his maximalist aims. I haven't seen any indication that they wouldn't march on Kyiv tomorrow if they had the military capabilities. I think what we're seeing is that they're stopped where they're stopped. They stop where they're stopped. They don't have the capability to do that, but if they were allowed to strengthen through the world going along with promises of a ceasefire, which again, we also saw violated many times over the last year, decade, that they would strengthen and move on. I also want to mention on this topic that there is something really important when we're looking at what does Putin want, what is his next move. I've argued in a lot of different publications that what is happening today fits the criteria of genocide, and that's very important for policy reasons. It's important for policy reasons because genocides end in total victory. So one side wins, one side loses, and oftentimes outside parties assist. So that's very important when you're coming up with policy solutions, that things that would work for mass atrocity, where maybe some sort of lower level things will not work in this case. I also want to point out that, again, I think this theme of accident is very important. This theme of also a willfully orchestrated humanitarian disaster, which we could also look at a little more through that exact same lens, is very important. In the sort of policy advising that I do, we have to kind of remember that we look at mass atrocity prevention, genocide prevention, we pay attention to rockets, to missiles, to kinetic violence, and then we look at humanitarian aid. So we look at people who need electricity, they need food, etc. And these are often very siloed efforts. In this case, I think that those very much overlap and they need to be dealt with by the same people around the room, that it is this orchestration of people's lack of access to electricity, so hospital generators, people's orchestrated lack of access to heat, to keep them alive and healthy through the winter. So Michael's point about if we have managed to have some deterrent effect for a willful nuclear attack, but there's still a lot of wiggle room under there about what would constitute an accident, what would constitute an accident at the dam, what would constitute that. And so I think that these are very, very important conversations. You asked, just to sum up here, you asked what to watch out for with the narrative. The narrative to watch out for is that there will not be accidents in this. There will be orchestrated events that are presented as such.
And also, can I just add something in terms of policy solutions? I think also what can happen is better enforcement, for example, of the Russian ships that turn off their transponders and go to ports like Lebanon. The West can't use the excuse that Russia is stealing and shipping Ukrainian grain without a trace, because we have now investigative entities like Bell in Canada. There's who have very carefully documented where these ships from Russia are carrying the grain to. And, many of you will recognize the name Ihor Ostash, who used to be here as ambassador, I think. He's now ambassador of Lebanon. And he said that Russia has fully established a criminal system transporting stolen grain from Ukraine using mainly Syrian and Russian vessels. And not only that, through Turkey, Syria, and other countries of the Middle East. Ukraine says it's traced 78 vessels involved in the transfer of stolen grain. And by the way, I gotta say, because I've been doing a little bit of a tour of Ukrainian diplomatic posts, because of the war, the budgets of most Ukrainian diplomatic missions have been cut drastically. So they're heavily under-resourced. Taras, one more second. Also, I think we can do more lobbying of Russia allies in the Middle East and in African countries, not to do business with Russia. And maybe they need to be reminded, you either do business with us or you do business with Russia. Russia only constitutes 2% of global GDP, US and Western allies, 78%. Also, what could also help, because I've seen it with my own eyes, is easing of border checks, for example, on the Poland-Ukrainian border. Any of us who have crossed that border have probably seen lineups of trucks 20 kilometers long. I asked the Polish government officially on behalf of CNN Opinion why this is happening all of a sudden. And they said, well, one reason, of course, is there's more cargo transshipped from the sea onto land. But the other thing they said, which kind of threw me for a loop, we have to do more livestock checks. So I think the EU has to get on this and give them more resources if that's what they're lacking, and more high-tech equipment to get Ukrainian exports out more quickly. And also, just quickly, things like solidarity corridors, where Ukrainian exports can be fast-tracked to EU ports. And finally, Canada. We have so much expertise here in terms of grain silos. We could play a role in terms of rebuilding them. We have expertise in solar power. Ukraine is lacking electricity right now. If electricity goes out to the port of Odessa, we're in very, very big trouble. So, sorry, I have to let those things in.
Yeah, Taras Maluszewski. Michael, I'll direct this question to you. Based on your time in Ukraine and the sources that you have, two parts. A, what can you tell us about the Kerch Bridge explosion linking Russia with Crimea? And secondly, what can you tell us about the internal strife going on, say, within Russia, the Kremlin leadership, the security forces, and the army?
Always great questions for me. I'll make sure the answer, if that's okay. The Kerch Bridge, it's hard to say. President Zelensky said in a joint interview with CTV, CBC, Radio Canada that I noticed he used the words, to my knowledge. We weren't involved. So we take that at face value. Some analysts have said that it might have been the Russians themselves. Look at what they did with Chernobyl, but this could have been an accident where they were shipping ammunition or whatever, poorly shipped. Explosion happened that way. It could have been internal forces. But I gotta tell you, sitting in Odessa around that time, right afterwards, we all went back to sleeping in our clothes, sleeping in the corridor, or listening to the air raid sirens because we knew there would be retaliation. We knew that Putin would use that as an excuse to strike hard, very, very hard at Ukraine. In terms of what's going on in the Kremlin, it's almost impossible to know, but I noticed that US intelligence is saying more and more that there's more instability in terms of people being disappointed with Mr. Putin's actions. I don't think I described the mobilization. I mean, think about it, 300,000 people as a roll of the dice for Putin. I think that this is something that brought the war to all area codes of Russia, and that I don't think he'll regain all of the support he lost. And, of course, it's nice to see Russians protesting this demobilization, but let's be clear, most of them are protesting the mobilization, not the war in Ukraine. I think, one last point, I think the only way to really tighten the noose around Mr. Putin is to really tighten up more of the restrictions on his inner circle. And what I mean, for example, is to bring us to the point where if you're a Russian oligarch and you want to go vacation, no, you're not going to go to Turkey, you're not going to go to Dubai, you're not going to go to Monaco. The only places you can go is to North Korea or to those illegally built Chinese islands in the South China Sea.
Sure, so I think that just to wrap up there too, one of the other things that from a policy perspective we can do is really try to structure sanctions in such a way that every action is seen as splintering those groups and those alliances within the oligarchic structures. I think that there could be a little bit more mentioning of Putin's age every now and again, because he is 70 and he is going to bequeath an economic albatross to his country, to his oligarchic clients. And so I think that that's also very important. And then also just to look at this question of military training, it's very important. Nations like ours have, one of the other hats I wear is my country's Marine Corps University. We have professional military education in the form of university degrees in terms of multi-year training, in terms of rotation. And so just looking at what effect that will have in terms of both skill and training for all these people being mobilized, but also their morale. You are walking into a very dangerous situation with zero preparation. And so I am interested to see, I think the strategy there is really horrifically to use that front line as a stall tactic to sort of many of those people will die until they can build up a more trained force. I think that's the goal there. We'll see what happens.
I think also that, think about it, 300,000 in the mobilization. Once those men are sent to the front line, once those boxes start coming back to the mothers, that is a very, very potent force for Mr. Putin. Angry mothers. In fact, there is an association of mothers of Afghan soldiers who died, and they're apparently coming back into action to protest what's going on in Ukraine. So watch that space for instability too.
Just to follow up on Christina's comment, talk about how old Putin is. When Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, there was a huge march in Moscow. Over 25,000 people showed up. And one guy was carrying a sign in English that says, the average lifespan of a Russian man is 67 years old. Putin's 64, only 3 more years to go.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, John Patrician. I was going to deal particularly with the stealing of Ukrainian agricultural products and disseminating around the world and lining Putin's pockets and the war machine with Ukrainian products. And you indicated about the inability to track the ships. The problem is you've got buyers. I heard an interview on CBC with the United Nations representative from Yemen. And he says, when you're starving, you don't give a hoot who you're buying what from, as long as you've got food. Lebanon is a great example, but Uganda, 80 countries is mind-boggling. That will buy what Putin is stealing today, and that's unstoppable. That is the other thing. 20 years from now, we'll have a meeting in this room and people will say, do you realize in Ukraine, they were stealing food from Ukrainians and selling it so Russians could profit? However, I would like to address the elephant in the Ukrainian room with a view from Georgia. In a few short days, we're going to be having midterm elections. And pray tell, a speaker called McCarthy in the House and a majority leader called McConnell in the Senate have already indicated they will curtail, if not abolish, aid to Ukraine, economic, humanitarian, and particularly military. To the people of Georgia, the beautiful people of Valdosta and environments, the great golf courses, are they taking umbrage, or is there any hope in hell that the war will end in the United States Congress?
So we called it a political prognostic, I'll do my best. You know what I will say is I've tracked public opinion really closely because obviously very important in each of our countries, and I watch American public opinion quite closely, and it continues to shatter expectations, really. I haven't seen such a durable coalition in my country on any issue in years. I noted, Speaker, soon to be, we guess, comments. I thought that there was pushback from McConnell's office, but I'm not a political scientist. Actually, I specialize in Russia, Ukraine as an anthropologist, so check with my colleagues there. But I really do feel that the coalition will move beyond our midterms. I do think that we can continue to advocate. And I would also say too that we can think about how we can build a coalition. I was thinking about how it's really, really wonderful to be in a room with so many people who have family stories of the Holodomor, who can talk on a very human level about both Soviet and Russian imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism. Your voice really matters, I think, in building the coalition beyond just the West, in terms of other countries that need to be reminded that Soviets as a sort of anti-imperialist savior narrative is not quite all it's cracked up to be, that there are a lot of stories that were happening underneath there. So I'd love to see what comes from the people in the room and the connections you have there. And the other thing that I'll finally just say on that question is the UN Convention it's called the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. It was signed and ratified by 152 countries, which means that countries are legally obligated not just to prevent genocide, but also to punish it, and that there are legal obligations there that we're watching quite closely. And so, again, we need to, I think, even just build a coalition that obviously the West, that our countries, my country and Canada will play is very, very important, that the EU will play is very, very important. I say do more and do it faster to those countries, but also let's think about building the coalition to make this a really sustainable thing, both for stopping the war, for Ukraine's victory, but then also for prosecution.
Just briefly, I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said. I gotta say though, in my travels, I'm getting a little bit worried though, because for example, I was in London recently, and I had people coming up to me there and saying, why are our taxpayers' dollars funding this Ukraine war? They're not getting it. So to me, that signals that Ukrainian officials, Ukrainian diaspora leaders, in fact, all of us have to do a better job to explain to people why this is important. And I was on a panel recently, a frontline online panel in London, and we said there that, if need be, people have to be told now to prepare for a wartime economy, I think the United Kingdom, Canada, US, because I think this will get worse before it gets better. But people should be explained to why should you pay those higher bills? Why should you perhaps shiver in the dark for the time being? It's going to be a tough winter, not only in Ukraine, but in a lot of places. So it worries me too when I think some Western leaders use the Ukraine war as too much of a factor for what's happening in their own economies. So it has to be explained very carefully, but it has to happen now.
And we know that there's also been liberal Democrats that want to appease, and they actually wrote a letter and the White House got it back down. I was just in Washington. I'm a member of the Parliamentary Alliance on China, Hong Kong, and of course, President Xi's dictatorship, which is now been confirmed. So Marco Rubio was there, and I can tell you that the defense hawks, which are lots of them in Congress on both sides, of Democrats and Republicans, really want to move on this because they see right now what we witnessed with the Russian army is that they're weakened, and we need to keep on going and helping Ukraine. So I think there's going to be a balance, and just like we have in our own problem, there's people on both sides of this issue, but I can tell you that at the end of the day, we want peace in Ukraine.
Zoriana Lysenko from Montreal, originally Winnipeg. Maybe your comments from both. As we mark the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, I believe that France and Germany has not recognized this genocide, and the states not so also, although they're having success state by state. How do you feel, what more pressure could be given? Because certainly this is unacceptable, and surely they see If they did not understand Stalin's tactics, they see what Putin is doing. Your comments, please.
Sure. So one of the topics that working in Ukraine has given me a lot of exposure to is what we call disinformation, right? Because it goes back much further than the way we talk about it today. It goes back with the ways that both the suppression of evidence of the Holodomor by the Soviets, as well as a lot of active counter narratives, propaganda about it, led to a lot of both mistakes about interpretation before we had access to the documents that we have today that I study, and then also just people running with political agendas. So I think that that's led to, as Marta also alluded to in her talk, the need to really build up the scholarship around it. I'm an empiricist by training. I just I look at documents. I have the same approach for cases around the world. And my findings indicate an empirical, replicable case, which is very important for social scientists, and that the Holodomor was a genocide. And so I think just trying to be, in my role as a social scientist, explaining very clearly the process I use, explaining very clearly that I use this process in both cases that are happening now, as well as historical cases and around the world. I look at them all the same way, and this is what my findings are. And so I do find, personally, as we're all kind of grappling with our new roles and the conditions of 2022, just trying to be very unequivocal, which, often social scientists where we hedge and this and that, and just trying to be very unequivocal with the findings of my research and say that I think the 90th anniversary, in light of what is happening now, in light of how it helps us understand the Kremlin, in light of how it helps us make the case for why Ukraine matters, to our communities and to our countries. I think that this is an important year for it, and I think that the facts support these designations. So I hope that they will move forward.
Christa Kulichkov from Winnipeg. When I'm listening to commentators on the media, some of them mention the fact that the West has to really decide whether they want Ukraine to win or not. So I'm just asking, what are the factors behind that kind of hesitation, continual hesitation of the West in terms of, actually dealing with the fact that this is a huge geopolitical international global situation, and why is there such hesitation going on with it?
Permit me to answer it this way. I just wanted to read you something that I put in my presentation, but saved it on purposes of time, then maybe Christina can. So a few months ago, I wrote for CNN. This partially answers your question, I think. If bombing a children's hospital isn't crossing a red line, what is? And here's what I said. I've worked many complex humanitarian emergencies before, but this is different for me. These are my people being injured and killed. I watch as large swaths of land my ancestors introduced to me in childhood through Ukrainian folk songs and poems as a bucolic land of freedom fighters and brave dissidents is being transformed into killing fields. No wonder my dreams keep me in a captive state of despair. 2 weeks into the war, scenes of carnage, like that of the Mariupol hospital, have become part of the daily horror for Ukrainians that can't be switched off. The indiscriminate shelling of what are meant to be safe havens for women and children needs to be established as a red line that no thuggish regime should be allowed to cross. So I think one of the hesitancies, if we can even use that word, among Western leaders is that I think they have to grow a spine, not only establishing these red lines that once you cross it, there will be consequences. But I think a lot of them are just afraid of that N-word, the nuclear button, using tactical nuclear or even worse. And Putin knows this. He's very good at not only manipulating the egos of Western leaders, but also the feelings, I think, of Western electorate. So until they get over what a lot of Ukrainian officials have called as blackmail, I don't think we're going to see much progress. I mean, it's difficult to believe that this is actually happening. But the other thing is the reality of geopolitics. A lot of these leaders are up for re-election. I don't want to give away my political affiliations or feelings, but God forbid the guy with the orange hair get back into the White House. Of course, he said it, and he didn't do that. If he was president still, that war would have never happened. But you can be sure that there will be concessions within that none of us could agree with.
I think that covers it really thoroughly, Michael.
Hello, my name is Larissa Patrician, teacher at Tisla High School. And also I would like to say thank you very much to Mr. Bazan, our sponsor of the bill C-459. Thank you very much for excellent panel. And also last week we had one of the best PD session at MTS, Manitoba Teacher Society, and I was able to invite, and we had a presentation with Valentina Kureev. First of all, thank you very much to Irka Balan, who also came and presented a little more. Valentina Noseworthy, and also my colleague and I, Luba Fedorki, I'll ask Luba Fedorki to come here, please. We wrote a Candle of Promise, and I'll read in Ukrainian since I'm originally from Lviv. And I would like to also correct as a teacher, if you could please pronounce Kyiv, not Kyiv, because Kyiv is Russian. So if it's possible, I teach our students in Canada, and I will also teach you a little bit to pronounce. So I'll start with Ukrainian and I'll pass to English version. Шанувати пам'ять невинних жертв Голодомору, визнавати правду скоєного геноциду, передавати знання нащадкам діаспори, запалити свічку в наших серцях. Вічна їм пам'ять.
Дякую, Риша. Ви можете набути ті bookmarks там при столі. Candle of Promise. This is the promise that we as Ukrainians make for our children to remember and honor the innocent souls of Holodomor, acknowledge the truth of this deliberate genocide, educate future generations in diaspora, burn the flame eternal in our hearts. Vічна їм пам'ять.
Yars Bourne from Edmonton. I just wanted to point out a telling incident that sort of flitted across the media coverage and passed very quickly, and I don't think a lot of people noticed it. That was at Mariupol. My understanding is they took down the Holodomor monument and melted it, and they're making a monument to the great Russian liberators of the city of Mariupol. I think it speaks volumes about the kind of regime we're dealing with. We've seen already in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine what they're doing, how they're pressuring the teachers to adopt a Russian curriculum, which is the Russian version of history, and that this is all of this stuff points to the fact that there is a genocide going on in Ukraine right now, and it's a good example of how they operate. That they will rewrite history. He who controls the past controls the future. We all know Orwell's chilling words, and he found no better. Well, he wrote it describing basically the Soviet Union. He knew what it was all about. Thank you.
Yeah, no, just quickly, in the recently liberated areas, it's horrifying what is found. For example, I think it was Vice News had a video today or yesterday on TikTok, and they showed a school that was used as a base for Russian soldiers. And they turned the Bombaskovesha, the bomb shelter, into very comfortable living quarters, of course, used with stolen furniture and blankets and stuff from houses. But what was very interesting, there is a map of the United Kingdom on one of the walls, and the Russian soldiers there, before they were kicked out, driven away, they put the big Z mark in it. They put Garcia. I'm sure a lot of British people would be horrified to see that.
Yeah, I'll just quickly note too that I did notice that monument removed. I paid really close attention to that, looking at perpetrator logics. What are they doing? And I paid very close attention to the repainting of street signs, to changing the spelling of Mariupol. when at such a time, they had ostensibly come to rescue a population that was under threat for cholera. And one of the first activities that they're doing is changing, these spellings and these colors. And so that is very important in creating our understanding of perpetrator logic, not just to batter a group, but to really eliminate Ukrainianness, Ukrainian as a national group. So that those monuments, those things like that are really significant for what I look for.
Lubomir Shulakevich from Winnipeg. My question is it not time to designate Russia as a terrorist state and also stop all giving out visas to Russians that would like to visit Canada and the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I was on CBC Radio about a week ago, and I put forth the question, why are we still issuing visas to Russia? But also, why is it that no Russian diplomats have been kicked out of Canada yet? Is it that Global Affairs Canada believes that the Kremlin only sends well-behaved diplomats to Ottawa, perhaps? Because the EU countries have kicked out, I think, 200 plus. And you just have to go to the social media threads of the Russian embassy, whatever. They clearly engage in disinformation. So I think there's good grounds to do that. But I think within the Trudeau government, there's a bit of lack of consensus on how the war should be, how the full-scale invasion should be dealt with. I will not have said this for the first time. I think Canada very much bungled its response in terms of over-reliance on sanctions, late to the game in terms of sending lethal weaponry, that unbelievable debacle with the Deputy Chief of Protocol, Dyck, showing up at the Russian embassy, the Nord Stream generators, our diplomats, who I have enormous respect for, well, they were one of the first to leave and one of the last to come back. What's that all about? And the so-called opening of the Canadian embassy in Kyiv, they didn't open it fully, and it still remains, I think, at partial capacity today. So there's a lot more that Canada can do, but definitely I think that the visa thing and also the expulsion of diplomats, and I think we can work with Western allies also to stop Russian tourists from coming in totally. I think that will create quite a bit more pressure on Mr. Putin.
The way I would answer that is I always just say, think through the kind of long-term alternative. So, if we think through a world where Ukraine does not win, what does that look like? How does that look to China? If we look at what does it look like if Russia does this degree of civilian targeting and they're not codified as a state sponsor of terror, what does that look like? What standard does that create in the future? So that's the way I look at that, and that's the way I encourage our representatives to look at that too. If this level of willful intentional targeting does not constitute that, then why and what standard is that creating for the future?
I'll just say this because we've had these discussions in the House of Commons, Defense Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, and there has been drop balls way too much with the Canadian response and the way we move forward as conservatives. We've been asking for lethal weapons since 2018, knowing that this was going to escalate, and here we are today. The ambassador of Russia to Canada should have been declared persona non grata that day that they marched into Donbass and escalated this war and started coming down from the north. And so, why we continue to sit back. We're having this big argument right now in the House hall, since the protests and happened in Tehran and all the women that have been arrested, over 200 killed now. But why isn't the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, listed as a terrorist organization? And they're now in Ukraine flying those kamikaze drones for the Russians. they need,
Especially after the downing of PS 752 as well.
oh yeah, always remember, 82 Canadians were on that plane, and were killed, it's mass murder. Again, that's when we started calling for IRGC to be listed as a terrorist organization. Now they're in Ukraine doing Russia's dirty work. You know, you got the Wagner group that should be, you know, a bunch of mercenaries that need to be listed as terrorists as well, and not be able to take the money that they're earning from Russia and hide it here in Canada. You know, so it's we need to get better on our sanctions regime. We need to make sure that we're taking a more principled stand and be more methodical in how we work with our allies and make sure we isolate Putin and his henchmen even more so on the world stage. But as to, you know, we still have to have, unfortunately, some roads of communication open to us because Russia is still an Arctic nation. And it's great to see now that all the other Arctic nations are all members of NATO. But at the same time, we have to still be able to talk to Russia about, you know, Arctic search and rescue, climate change, and everybody's at the UN, of course, in their presentations on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea on who gets what territory in the Arctic Ocean as it continues to open up for more resource exploration. But you know, these are the things that we have to deal with. You want to say something?
Yeah, I think you know, it can be very frustrating when we sanction individuals because Russia, it's against their constitution to actually extradite. And in a few short weeks in The Hague, we're going to see a decision by the court there on the 4 suspects charged in the downing of MH17, 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian. They are in Russia right now. But my point here is that I think you and I were talking about this earlier, I think, is over the passage of time, people get careless and they make mistakes and they'll step out of the boundaries of Russia. And maybe they'll go to Dubai, maybe they'll go to Turkey, but we also have to pressure those allies as well to now these guys and send them wherever they have to go.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the crowd, and I think we have to really say, oh, wait, I'm sorry. You're speaking.
Slava Wisniewski from Toronto. I read something very interesting from Michael McKean. I think that it's really upsetting. He wrote today, Russian war criminals sanctioned by Canada are on a list with no consequences. They're not barred from travel to Canada, for example. The reason is the Canadian government refuses to sanction Russians under the Magnitsky Law. It won't explain the reason for this bizarre refusal. Maybe.
Yeah, so most of the sanctions Canada has issued has been done under the Special Economic Measures Act, and travel bans are done under the Canadian Immigration Act. And I'm still trying to get better answers from the people over at Foreign Affairs as how they actually administrate it. Magnitsky sanctions, the way we wrote up the legislation, and at the end of the day, we had all party support, including the Liberals. Magnitsky law requires ongoing reporting by financial institutions, real estate boards, and others who have been notified that there is someone on the sanctions list that could be hiding their wealth here. Maybe they bought a bunch of houses, other properties, businesses. And so those assets have to be frozen and then monitored. Under CEMA, it's much more lax. So by announcing sanctions through the Special Economic Measures Act, everybody assumes it's Magnitsky, but what they're doing is really just it's public relations. You know, we're naming, we're shaming, but we're not really doing the job of ensuring that those assets are frozen and that those individuals are prevented from coming to Canada. And so that is the issue, and we're actually working through that right now. There's one piece of legislation that my colleague Phil Lawrence has brought forward to do some amendments to Magnitsky. I've been in discussions with Bill Browder, just met with him again last week, and the wife of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was, of course, a Russian political opponent of Vladimir Putin, and he's now in prison on trumped up charges there as well, for pretty much for treason, and 21-year sentence he was given for speaking up against the war in Ukraine. So we're going to continue to move forward and making sure that there is an alignment of the sanctions regime in Canada, and that it's always called serving humanity, so that we know that these guys are gross human rights violators, that these individuals that are on the list are corrupt and enriching themselves at the cost of innocent people around the world. One of the interesting comments that we had at the National Defense Committee last week was Chief of Defense Staff Wayne Garrett was there. And we're witnessing Russia, especially their military, not being able to fight the proud Ukrainian patriots, the nationalists, the very movement that Stalin tried to kill in the Holodomor. And that nationalist movement, those patriots, are standing up against the Russian aggressors. General Eyre said that we are looking at the potential of Russia becoming a vassal state of China. That the communist regime in China is going to control where Russia sells its products, how Russia funds its military, how Russia even rebuilds its army, which has been injured, maybe even orderly by the Ukrainian forces. That's going to change geopolitics. And so as a final question, and to allow you, both of you to wrap up your comments as we close off this session. Professor, as an anthropologist, how does that patriotism that we're seeing in Ukraine today, that way they're defending their homeland, and plays out now compared to the history, and how Taras Shevchenko, who installed that national pride over 200 years ago. As well, can both of you talk about, Russia's relationship with China and how this could ultimately change the way geopolitics work in Europe, Asia, and around the world?
Sure, thank you for that tough and great final question. So I think that there's a few things going on with the way I answer that. So I think that, yes, like Ukrainians are the ones that I speak with every day, the ones that I watch, and I'm so impressed by that. Yes, people are fighting for their societies, that even in academic language, we have something that we've heard as defensive nationalism. That just means nationalism to protect yourself from extermination. So a smaller group threatened by a larger one. Sound familiar? And so yes, people are fighting to preserve their societies, their ways of life. They're also fighting for their world, not just in a political and a national sense, but also their world and their families. So we look again at all of these reunion videos, that is a person's world. And so they are fighting for their entire world with their family. They're fighting for their freedom with their way to raise their family as they choose in a free and prosperous future Ukraine. And so yes, that is something that I think that I learned a lot from Ukrainians about understanding the cost of it, from the Revolution of Dignity down to the stories that are probably told in this room as well about what people's parents, grandparents, and beyond endured. And so, I think that we do need to do everything we can to ensure Ukraine's victory, that I feel very confident about. But we also, I think, need to remember and for people like me, especially, to communicate that we have a lot to learn from Ukrainians to revive that sense of understanding what is worth fighting for when it is the right things, which is what we're seeing on the Ukrainian side. Now to quickly pivot to geopolitics, I think that we are in for a very turbulent decades ahead for Western countries. I think that we are more united than we were. Again, thank you to Ukraine for that. I also have said that I have felt very confident in Ukraine's military ability to withstand this escalation, which I also feared, and that I think that the Ukrainian military is a very important ally, that is a very important military on the European continent, because, you know, I'm just a private citizen, but looking at, you know, the Asia, China, the question was about China. It's going to be a turbulent few decades ahead on multiple continents. And so we need societies that are committed to freedom, that are backed by also credible military behind those values. And so that is also something that I try to communicate about. We have things to learn from Ukraine, and then also Ukraine is a very important ally. It is a two-way street. So I know.
Before I answer that, I just wanted to read very quickly. My friend Natalia Antelova just published a piece in CNN Opinion. You can find it there. But we were talking all this afternoon and evening about history repeating itself. She said because of the mobilization and all these Russians fleeing into Georgia, where she's based, she said, today, as I walk under Tbilisi's carved balconies, many adorned with blue and yellow Ukrainian flags, Russian is all I hear. So even changes there in Georgia. You know, I think an indirect result of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is that Ukrainian nationalism has soared through the roof. I'm based in Odessa, and now I was in Lviv before, and on every second building, if not every building, there's a Ukrainian flag painted on there. But the more important thing is, I recently wrote a piece on how the language debate has become part of this situation as well, is that a lot of Russian speakers, Ukrainians who have spoken Russian from the day they were born, are switching over to Ukrainian in big numbers. And you see this happening around the country. There are some issues in regards to Russian-speaking Easterners coming to Western Ukraine and speaking Russia, or in the safe haven countries. But Ukrainians, I think, have never been as united, and never, as I said before, have been as angry to the point where they want to take back Crimea. They want to take back the occupied Donetsk and Luhansk. I've commented and written a lot about China and Taiwan, and I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, is that if there are no clear red lines, well, dictators, autocrats, they will do whatever they want. And I hate to say this, but of course, from the beginning of the war, Xi Jinping, who has just, got himself supreme leader for life, pretty much. Again, taking notes very carefully, but I have the feeling, and I hope I'm wrong, because I've been to Taiwan many times, beautiful people, incredible entrepreneurialism, technology, is that I think the stomach of the Chinese dragon is growling after consuming Macau and Hong Kong. We've seen what they've done in Hong Kong with draconian laws, that they will move next on Taiwan. And I think what we're also seeing is unnecessary ambiguity from the Biden administration. How many times now, I've lost count, has comments by Biden saying, for example, Putin should be removed from power, and I think it was in Warsaw, the White House Communications Office wanted it back. That is not a good thing to happen. So again, I think China may be on the US not following through on its security guarantees to protect Taiwan, and may make a move. We're not in a very good space right now. But again, the positive takeaway, of course, is again the unity, the patriotism of the Ukrainians, and also neighboring countries, the Baltic states, Poland, and elsewhere. I spend more time in Moldova. It's incredible, the support for Ukraine there. So I think that's something that's very, very positive to take away.
Well, I want to thank both of you, and I got to say that just to follow up on Michael's comments about Russian speakers, and I'm learning how to speak Ukrainian. So in Parliament, we have every spring like a Canada-Ukraine parliamentary internship program. And my intern was a young lawyer from Donetsk, living kind of in that Bielorussia area, south of Kyiv. And she, born and raised, spoke Russian. But she is such a patriotic Ukraine now that when she was hearing any of the girls flipping from Ukrainian over to Russian, she was giving them hell. She said, no, we're Ukrainian, we speak Ukrainian. And it was something to witness. And, so I think, Putin and, even back to Yanukovych, they're the guys that actually helped
expand Ukrainian patriotism throughout the country. For those of us who've been to places like Kharkiv and Odessa, it was kind of back and forth a bit, especially even after Maidan. There were still some Russian sympathizers there. You won't find them now. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panelists.
Thank you. I'll just add a few thank yous, if you'll indulge me. First to our guest presenters, Christina and Michael, for taking the time to travel long distances to be with us today. It's been a pleasure, and it was so nice that we didn't have to do this on Zoom. I have no idea how grateful I am. Your presentations were thought-provoking, and I think inspired us to understand that each of us has a role to play in this new global reality to protect fundamental human rights, call out the disinformation, protect democracy, and most importantly, to remember what we're all fighting for, because I think we're all in this together. Regardless how daunting it may seem, we can and need to be that positive force for change. So please accept our best wishes for continued success in your invaluable work. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to moderate today's presentations. Your commitment to Holodomor awareness and education is longstanding, and we are grateful that you accepted our invitation. On behalf of the Ukrainian community, please accept our immense gratitude, not only for your contribution to Holodomor-related causes, but your unwavering support for Ukraine and its people in their fight against Russian aggression. Thank you. Rights and extremely accommodating, logistically, with communications, and we do thank them for their support and cooperation today. Thank you to Ivana Zolnich for your challenging technical support today. We appreciate it. And thank you to the volunteers who made this room appear the way it does. It's lovely, and we're very grateful to you. And finally, my heartfelt thanks to the three ladies who have spearheaded the Canadian Holodomor Descendants Initiative and who are the drivers of this event. Three descendants of Holodomor survivors who are committed to making sure the flame of remembrance is never extinguished. Natalka Diduk from St. Catharines is here. And our two local organizers, Gerka Balan and Valentina Hausberg. Finally, just a reminder, November 26th is International and National Holodomor Remembrance Day. On this 89th anniversary of the Holodomor, raising awareness has possibly never been more critical than at this juncture in our history. Our commemorations must be worthy of the place of the Holodomor in our history, the place of the victims in our eternal memory, the place of the survivors in our grateful hearts. And as we remember, we also fuel the bravery, the fortitude, the determination, and the resilience that will lead us to victory. Our motto for this year, as will be soon announced by the Ukrainian World Congress, is we remember, unite, and shall overcome. And in Ukrainian, ми пам'ятаємо, єднаємося, переможемо. So on November 26th, I encourage you to participate in events in your community, and please do light a candle of remembrance in unity with Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine around the world. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for joining us. Slava Ukraini.